Hello, this is Jerry Kerr, and this is our third program in UU history. Perhaps it's more accurately described as the history of progressive thought among many Christians, mostly in Europe right now. We'll get to America later. So this is not just Unitarian Universalist history. This is a history of people, most of whom are Christians, who dared to think outside the box, we might say, in our own language today, but they had the nerve to do this. And it makes an exciting and dramatic story to see how folks actually risk their lives to dare to question the authority of the church of their day. So let's share our screen here. And I'll make this bigger. And here we are in Europe, and all the gray area here that's still held by the Catholic Church. Up here in the Netherlands, John Calvin's Reformed theology has really taken a hold. England, King Henry, in 1536, they had their own Reformation there. Scotland is strongly Calvinistic, Reformed Church theology, another way of putting it. Ireland has remained Catholic. And then there are these other spots. This color of brown are the Lutherans from Martin Luther's Reformation. Over here are spots of Transylvania that we'll talk a lot about today. The Reformed Church, Calvin's church, was very strong. Poland, right here, has remained strongly Catholic. But we'll talk about Poland a lot today because that's where the Polish Brethren became what we know today as the Socinians, who were very much early Unitarians and had beliefs strikingly different from the rest of Europe, as did the Unitarians in Transylvania. I wanted to talk quickly about the Diet of Elans. Down here in Switzerland, maybe if I move my mouse cursor, you'll be able to see it. And some of us do, of decrees, edicts that express the idea that religion should be tolerant of each other. They're few and far between from this era, but we should talk about the Diet of Elans, what happened. And this is a very small area. This was sort of like a local agreement, really. But Protestants from Northern Europe were fleeing towards northern Italy and a place in the Alps known as the Grisons. It's a range of mountains in the Alps, the Grison Alps. We'll show you the spelling here in a minute. But they found some safety there because radical Catholics were fleeing Italy and going to the Alps as well, the Grisons. And there they met up and they wrote the Diet of Elans, 1526, proclaimed religious freedom to choose between either Catholicism or the Reformed religion. Now, this was a very modest, this was not a huge move to create toleration amongst people of different religions. But it did. I mean, it was groundbreaking in the respect that it said Catholics, most of whom were radical Catholics, Reformed people, people from the Reformed traditions or from no traditions who didn't believe Martin Luther's ideas or John Calvin's ideas, many of them fled here, those who had the means to travel to this place in far northern Italy, in the Alps, the Grison range of the Alps. And there's Elans right there. Probably never heard of this. Most folks have not. But it was like a baby step towards toleration in the mid, where Protestants were battling Catholics, vice versa, and actually executing each other. And so, allow me to read this. While Servetus battled Calvin, Italian reformers fled from Italy to the safety of the Alps. And remember, this thing called the Renaissance is happening, especially in Italy. Started around 1450, about 100 years before the era we're talking about. And so there are many Italians who are straying from the one true Catholic faith. Those who are more radical have to flee in order to save their life. And they meet up with Protestants who have fled Northern Europe here in Italy, in the Grisan Alps. Just a few names that we should talk about. It's hard when, and there were many, but when you read about any of the three of these men, it's hard to believe they existed in that day and age and that they risked their lives to speak out. It seems they couldn't contain themselves. Biandrata from Italy, a physician. He goes to Geneva, Switzerland, because that's where Calvin, the reformer Calvin, his home base is. And he thinks he can escape the wrath of the Catholics by going to Geneva. Well, he very quickly learns that John Calvin has it in for him too. Biandrata, he doubts the deity of Jesus, thinks he can be safe from the Catholics in Geneva, but then Calvin wants to kill him too. So to the Grisan Alps. Ochino, a famous preacher in Italy, he got in real trouble first and foremost because he said, you shouldn't have, speaking to the Catholic Church, he said, you shouldn't have executed Servetus, the great anti-Trinitarian who wrote many books. Of course, it wasn't the Catholics. The Catholics wanted to execute Servetus. Calvin did that, got his hands on Servetus first, and had Servetus burned at the stake, as we talked about last week. But that was Ochino. He's anti-Trinitarian, says Jesus is not God, and he was really one of the first Italian reformers who really started writing and got things stirred up. Renato, a very famous preacher, he goes to Poland. And allow me to read you some of this. In this day and age, any of these folks could have been burned at the stake, but this is a time when Venice in Italy decided they should stop burning people at the stake, heretics that is, because they were trading partners with Germany. Trading couldn't be burning heretics at the stake. It was bad relationships between Venice, a big trading city, and Germany. So instead, they would quietly drown them in the Adriatic Sea. So 2 gondolas, one of them carrying the bound heretic, and another gondola would follow along. They would get out into the Adriatic a little ways, and they would put a board across between the 2 gondolas, and then the heretic, all tied up, would be placed on the board between the 2 gondolas, and then the gondoliers would slowly row out, and the board and the heretic would fall into the Adriatic. This was called a Venetian special by some later historians. I suppose, better than being burned alive at the stake. Such were the times in this day and age. And just that story in itself gives a real lesson on what these folks were risking by being rational and speaking their minds about the religion of their day. Just a quick word about the Renaissance. It valued humans more than they had been for many centuries. And the Catholic Church felt that as a slight to them. Human learning was affirmed. The classics were read. It had the effect of giving more weight, credibility to human learning, the ability to learn things other than what the church taught. This came off as a slight and very threatening to the Catholic Church, the Renaissance, that is. Not just in northern Italy, of course, but elsewhere as well. But the Renaissance did get its start in Italy around 1450. So that's one of the things that's happening here. And then in Poland and in Transylvania, there was more than just these modest reformations that happened in Germany with Martin Luther, and in Switzerland with John Calvin, and other smaller reformations in other areas. King Henry's in England, of course, which was very modest reformation. They didn't challenge things like the doctrine of the Trinity. They were just mainly challenging the authority of the Pope. They wanted to allow priests to be able to marry. So when I say that the Reformation in other areas of Europe were modest compared to those that would happen in Poland and Transylvania, you get the idea that the Unitarian thought that developed in Poland and Transylvania was really radical. Talking about Jesus not being more human, that Jesus's work on the cross, maybe that really didn't bring redemption to people and save people from hell. Infant baptism, these reformers would be saying that infant baptism wasn't really right. It should be a believer, like an adult who got baptized. But it happened in Poland and Transylvania. And you have to ask, and let's first say why. And if we ask first, why Poland and why Krakow, where Unitarian thought developed very strongly, it goes something like this. And let me back up one slide. Here we go. Poland was, although you wouldn't say isolated, it was a very strong, one of the strongest nations at the time, universities. The Catholics' hold on Poland had always been weak. And Krakow had the second oldest university in Europe. You don't think of it, but in those days, Poland was a leading nation. A lot of learning, and where learning takes place, inevitably, people start questioning the doctrines of the church. And then there was Copernicus of Poland, of course. It's an interesting story. Copernicus, of course, is an astronomer, and he realizes that, you know, the planets, Earth, they all revolve around the sun. At this time, the Catholic Church taught that everything revolved around the Earth, the geocentric understanding of the universe of its day, as it was known in its day. Copernicus is saying, no, all of the planets, including Earth, revolve around the sun, the heliocentric understanding of our solar system, as opposed to the geocentric, or you might say egocentric understanding of our solar system, according to the church of that day. Copernicus said no. Well, it occurs at about this same time, the Catholic Church, it's trying to gain membership, wants to have festivals, street festivals, on, of course, holidays of the year, seasonal holidays, but their Julian calendar is already off by 10 days. It was a very inefficient, inaccurate calendar. Well, they would in the end adopt Copernicus's, the calendar based on Copernicus's understanding of the heliocentric solar system, highly accurate, of course. But then, and so this would allow their church festivals to be held on the proper days throughout Europe. The only problem being is Copernicus's calendar went against Catholic Church doctrine. Later, Copernicus would be, I believe he would be, the word was anathematized. His books would be taken off the list of allowed readings. And this is a time when the Catholic Church came up with this idea of a list of books that should not be read. as opposed to a list of books that were okay, orthodox. Uh, that's worthy of some consideration. And it took this many hundreds of years of Christianity before the Catholic Church decided that there are some things that just should not be discussed, no matter how scientific, according to the science of the day. But so that's Copernicus and how he came to fall out of favor. His books were banned by the Pope, even though they continued to use his calendar. So that's why Poland, at least a few good reasons. It's a very learned place, and the kings did not allow the church, the Catholic Church, to interfere as much there. But then we could also ask, why Transylvania? It's also a birthplace of Unitarian thought. There's a lot of reasons. It was just a well-traveled place. Armies, immigrants. It was a crossroads. Many different peoples, nationalities, ethnicities, people from faraway places, Huns, Goths, Magyars, Romanians. They were herders, I believe. Mongol Tartars, the Saxons from up around Germany. They were Lutherans. Jews, Armenians, the Romani, also known as Gypsies. They were all there. Let me to back up here. Let's back up to that side. Yeah. They were all there and living in relative harmony. Transylvania was not what we would call a melting pot either. These groups maintained their identity, their own cultures, and yet they lived side by side more or less peacefully. In other words, this was a logical place for one more group, another religious group of people, to come into being and to be allowed, tolerated, and that group would be the Unitarians. But back to Poland. It begins in Poland very early. And Biandrata, who we talked a lot about, he is up in Poland taking care of the Queen of Poland, Queen Bona. He's an expert in women's health. And he has read Servetus's books that disagree with the Trinity. And here's Michael Servetus again as a review in one of his books on the Trinity. And he has fled, Biandrata that is, has fled Geneva after disagreeing with Calvin. Calvin is after him too and knows of Biandrata's heretical. But so Biandrata is there, and he makes good friends with Gonesius, who's founder of the Polish Brethren, and will be the founder of what it becomes known as the minor church, the minor Reformed church in Poland. Paulus is also a powerful preacher, and there's a story, seems to be well-founded about Paulus, that is well worth relating. It seems Paulus was preaching one day, and he's in Krakow in Trinity Church, and he's preaching there on Trinity Sunday, but he's speaking against the idea. He also denies that people should even worship Jesus, that God is God, Jesus, his divine son, should of course be heeded, his teachings, but you shouldn't even worship Jesus. So he's preaching in Trinity Church on Trinity Sunday, and lightning strikes the steeple of the church. And of course, the Orthodox, who don't like Paulus, they think it's a sign of God's disfavor. But the radicals, they're saying that it's a sign of God's favor. So much for lightning strikes being easily understood in terms of their meaning, in terms of what they mean God is feeling. Both sides thought that it was giving affirmation to their understanding. Gonesius has also read Servetus, of course. He's been trained in Wittenberg, Germany, and also spent time in Switzerland. And he's also this is the time, Servetus, of course, has already been executed, but Dionysius is very active in spreading the thoughts of Servetus and other, what we would call, what were in the day, radical reformers. They're both kicked out of the Reformed Church of Poland in 1565 and become the fathers, you might say, of the Polish Minor Reformed Church. The exact title being a Minor Reformed Church of Poland. They become the Polish Brethren in common terms. Remember, the Queen of Poland at this time, Queen Bona, will be the mother of Queen Isabella, who will be in Transylvania, and Queen Isabella will be the mother of King John Sigismund, the first and only Unitarian king. So in Transylvania, and I just showed you a picture of young King John, it's interesting to remember, to note that King John's life and his reign as making it to being a king in Transylvania hung by a thread at times, and it was because his mother, Queen Isabella, had a good way of getting people onto her side. She was, of course, a product of the Renaissance. Her mother, Queen Bona, had evidently taught her well some progressive ways of thinking, and she was able to persuade King Suleiman to take care of her and her son. Twice, King Suleiman was able to fend off the approaches of a German army under King Ferdinand of the Holy Roman Empire. King Ferdinand wanted Transylvania for himself, but King Suleiman, who commanded a big army with big sharp swords, both times was able to get King Ferdinand to back down. And it's worthy of note that there seems to be a little doubt about it, that this learned queen, Queen Isabella, had a big influence on the course of history, of Unitarian history. She herself, her main goal was to make sure that her son made it to being the actual king of Transylvania. And history may have been very different were it not for Queen Isabella. Here she is again, and she shows her progressive thinking. She's trying to keep the Lutherans and the Catholics in Transylvania from each other's throats. And she creates the very first version of the Edict of Torda. As you'll see, it's added to twice more in the coming years. But she issues this decree, and it's groundbreaking, several steps above the Diet of Alans that we talked about just earlier. And she says in the Edict of Torda, in order that each might hold the faith which he wished, with the new rights as well as free will. So another first, and this is sort of the Edict of Torda, first edition. But as I mentioned earlier, you don't find this kind of thinking much in Europe or elsewhere. So, and still in Transylvania, King John finally becomes of age and becomes the king. His mother dies, and King John finds himself a preacher from the Krakow area. And Francis David, he's tried out several different faiths, Catholic, turned Lutheran, turned Calvinist, a powerful preacher in all of the denominations. He had preached at three of the largest churches of the Reformed tradition, the Calvinist tradition in Poland. And so now he's comes to the court of young King John Sigismund, who himself is very interested in progressive religious thought. That's not necessarily a given, but again, he's the product of a very progressive thinking mother from the Renaissance. And he's delighted to find David, takes him in as the court preacher. And at the same time, let's try this again. There we go. George B. Andrada is there. He had been caring for Queen Isabella. And so you have a court of three very progressive thinkers, and all of them, especially B. Andrada and David, are familiar with the thoughts of Michael Servetus. They doubt the doctrine of Trinity. They doubt many other things as well. The divinity of Jesus. Meanwhile, B. Andrada is back and forth between Poland and Transylvania. So B. Andrada is sort of a traveling doctor and is bringing his Unitarian thoughts, we might say, to both Poland and Transylvania. There's a great deal of unrest in Transylvania between Lutherans, Catholics, Calvinists, and King John is very interested in the thoughts that, so he decides to call a debate. This was, as I've mentioned before, in several other instances, sort of an indoor sport at the time. They took it seriously, and it was seen as an alternative to going to war, killing each other. And they really believed that they could make some headway in determining the true faith. I should also mention that this is a time where it became, and the Edict of Torda makes it clear that a very early progressive value, religious value, was not just doubting the doctrine of the Trinity or doubting whether or not the Bible really showed Jesus was divine, if that's really was Jesus' self-understanding. But perhaps the foremost progressive idea is toleration. That because you can't prove for a fact these ideas about God and Jesus and the Christian religion in general, that toleration should be the rule of the day. You see that in the Edict of Torda, and you'll see that further along in the Polish Unitarians, that its toleration should actually be part of your religion. So at this great debate, David spoke for the Unitarians, and he was very successful by all accounts. There was no actual winner declared, and sometimes that happened in debates, but it was believed that David was so convincing that this decree, and again, King John had issued this just a year earlier, but now he felt that it really has some teeth because their man, Francis David, had proven to a large extent this idea that Jesus was actually somewhat subordinate to God and that it was in the Bible to the satisfaction of many people. And so here's this Edict of Torda, and again, it's an edict of toleration, not saying that there's just one true religion, Unitarianism. No, it didn't do that. It said instead, you can't compel people to believe one thing or the other because it's a matter of their soul, a matter of their conscience. And it ends with, therefore, none of the superintendents or others shall abuse the preachers. No one shall be reviled for his religion by anyone. A revolutionary statement for its day. There's just no doubt about it. And here's David in a very famous painting that I wanted you to see. Famous, I should say, I should qualify that. It's famous for Unitarian Universalists because David was such a passionate and effective speaker, debater for his idea, for his rational understandings of what was in the Bible. And I should make it clear, they were debating the Bible. And if you look at the Bible even today, as did Servetus before Francis David and the many others, the doctrine of the Trinity isn't there. And there's also many different understandings of Jesus contained in the Bible. So here's David, and you'll find this this painting in some UU churches up on the wall. A lot of drama there. And I should back up. Perhaps you've read this. Let me read it for you. There is no greater piece of folly than to try to exercise power over conscience and soul, both of which are subject only to their creator. But, and this has been going on for a while, the Catholic Counter-Reformation. Remember, it was way back in, I believe, 1513, thereabouts, when Martin Luther started the Reformation in the area we now know as Germany. So the Catholic Reformation has been going on for a while. Here's the Council of Trent, 1540 council, I must say. But they're not going to take the Reformation wherever it has happened in Europe. They're not going to take it sitting down. They do, I must say, take the Reformation seriously to some extent. They say, yes, our priests should be better educated. We shouldn't allow priests or bishops to be in charge of 3 or 4 churches where they never show up at all. They just get their cut from the collection plate, so to speak. That's called absenteeism. So they did take some of the Reformation seriously. And on other matters, though, not. They, for instance, were obviously not willing to listen to anyone who doubted the doctrine of the Trinity or matters pertaining to the divinity of Jesus or infant baptism, any of those what we might call absolute essentials to the Catholic faith, or matters of such gravity that that they weren't willing to talk about any of those matters. Priests being married, that was also part of the Reformers' ideas. The Catholic Church would not change that doctrine, of course, and many others as well. Another one that deserves to be mentioned, Reformers especially, doubted the efficacy of infant baptism. Anyone at this time can read in the Bible that the only people that are being baptized are adults. That's pretty clear in the New Testament. But the Catholic Church, of course, is not willing to give up the idea that infant baptism is both effective and needed to keep the child out of hell should they die. And so part of the Council of Trent was, if anyone denies that infants newly born from their mother's wombs, even though they be sprung from baptized parents, are without original sin, let him be anathematized. Anathematized is not as bad as being condemned, and obviously not as bad as being executed. But it was not, in this day and age, being anathematized was a bad thing. I don't think we should research it, whether or not a person was allowed to take communion if you were anathematized, which was, of course, essential for the forgiveness of your sins. It was a big deal in any case. And so as part of the Counter-Reformation, the Pope of that day formed the Jesuits, and they would become very influential in enforcing the Counter-Reformation, military-like discipline. He was Ignatius Loyola. Loyola, pictured here, was an ex-military man, and he organized his monks with military discipline. It says here that Loyola said, "I believe that the white that I see is black, if the hierarchical church so defines it." Quite a statement. I should mention here, well, and let me back up for just one moment for a general statement about our program, not just today's, but all of our programs about Unitarian Universalist history. All of this happened a long time ago. It's easy to forget that while we're in the midst of saying talking about how this or that church was what we would think of as being extremely cruel, irrational, killing people, religious wars that seem absurd to us now, that happened a long time ago, and that in fact we live in an age when there are many progressive Christians, progressive religious denominations that are what we might call allies in this search for a new way of thinking about Christianity and a new way of thinking about Jesus. And the word heretic is not used very frequently at all nowadays. Some still do, of course, but as a rule of thumb now, and I'll mention this again, as a rule of thumb though, we need to remember that this happened a long time ago. And if yes, there are still abuses committed, what we would see, abuses committed in the name of Christianity, they're much fewer and far between. And we need to keep our allies in progressive thinking about what religion can be to the benefit of all of us. And having said that, to go back a ways to the 1940s, really, Hitler really liked how the Jesuits were organized. And Hitler said, "I learned much from the order of Jesuits. Until now, there has never been anything more grandiose on the earth than the hierarchical organization of the Catholic Church. I transferred much of this organization into my own party." So that's Hitler on the Jesuits. But then to jump ahead some hundreds of years, it would be the Jesuits who would become the very likeliest of religious orders who would become very understanding of native populations who wanted to keep aspects of their own religion. Even though Jesuit monks would be in this or that country proselytizing, trying to convert people to Christianity, it was oftentimes the Jesuit monks who would be the first to, as we say nowadays, go native, to become very, very friendly with the people of the country where they were supposed to be proselytizing, and allow the native peoples to maintain aspects of their own religion. So religious orders obviously change over the centuries, as certainly did the Jesuits. Also a product of the Catholic Counter-Reformation was an emphasis on hell. They put it to good use in trying to scare people back into the one true church, as they felt the Catholic Church was. Of course, the study of the doctrine of hell, the idea of hell, I should say, and how it changed and developed over the many centuries is one of the ways that our Universalist ancestors would come to say, you know, the idea of hell is obviously a product of human thinking. It developed over time. In this particular time, Erasmus, the great from Holland, who was a Catholic and remained so, he was able to escape some of the condemnation of the Catholic Church, although his books were also prohibited after a time. But Erasmus wrote about the Catholic Church's emphasis on hell. They draw exact pictures of every part of hell as if they had spent years in the place. A very biting commentary on the Catholic Church's use of hell to scare people back into the Catholic Church. And of course, these depictions here were written earlier, or rather painted earlier, but an example of this emphasis on hell during the Catholic Counter-Reformation. And so, back to Poland and Transylvania, these Jesuits arrive, and the new king, King John Sigismund, died in 1571, and Stephen Bathory would become Prince of Transylvania, and his brother would work to restore the Catholic Church. And to say that they were rough on the Unitarians in Transylvania and then later in Poland is a bit of an understatement. Uh, Unitarians can't publish books without permission. The Unitarians is given to the Jesuits. If you were a Unitarian, you could not hold a public office. This would also take place in Poland as well as Transylvania. It was just the edicts of Torda were, of course, ignored, any edicts of toleration. But as we'll see, the Unitarian Church in Transylvania hung on. They were able to survive, even though they were a religious minority and in many ways were persecuted. Still in Transylvania, and remember, this is the time when the Catholic Church that is now taken over in Transylvania, they published a no new innovations rule where you couldn't, they were going to allow the Unitarians to exist there. They could stay. That does not happen in Poland, as we'll see. But you couldn't be innovative. The Unitarian thought of that day had to stay as it was. Well, Francis David, who we've talked a lot about, he wasn't going to put up with that. You couldn't stop him from being innovative. And he decided that you should not pray, that's something that Jesus isn't God. You should only pray to God. And he denies the virgin birth. Well, this is obviously an innovation. The Catholic king puts David in prison. David doesn't survive long at all, I believe less than a year or so. And he dies in prison in 1579. Before he dies, though, Biandrata, remember Biandrata's connection to Poland, he's back and forth between the two countries. He convinces Faustus Socinus, the Italian thinker who's shown up in Poland and is slowly but surely becoming the leader of the Polish Brethren, who would later start calling themselves the Socinians after Faustus Socinus. Biandrata convinces Faustus to come to Transylvania, try and talk some sense into Francis David. Biandrata just wants Francis David to shut up, be quiet, you're going to get killed. Evidently, he's telling Francis David that you're going to get killed if you don't learn to keep your mouth quiet. Faustus, though, even though he's right there in Transylvania, he is not successful. And then David is put on trial and put into prison. He dies very quickly. Here's a picture of what I believe are the remains of the castle prison where David died. And there's a yearly gathering there in honor of Francis David. And David wrote, "Neither the swords of popes, nor the cross, nor the image of death, nothing will halt the march of truth." And it's true. It's another reminder that progressive religious people of every age who have doubted the pronouncements of churches who say they have the final truth, those thinkers, those people who have the nerve to say no, many of them have paid the ultimate price with their life. Others have just lost their possessions, their prestige in the community, things like that, because they also would refuse to be quiet. And we, in many ways, we have a great debt. We owe those thinkers a great debt. Over to Poland, the Socinians are still hanging on. And as I mentioned, Socinus arrives there well after the Polish Brethren have already made their relatively radical pronouncements. But Faustus from Italy, like many other reformers that came up from Italy, has other ideas and is evidently a natural leader. He doesn't even want to become their minister, their leader, but they basically force it upon him. And here's are some of the beliefs of the Polish brethren, who later become called the Society. Servetus was right. The doctrine of the Trinity is not in the Bible. You'll find a mention in just one place of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. It doesn't say that they're all three identical, anything like that. That language in the Bible is called by scholars tridentan, not Trinitarian. As we mentioned last week, perhaps the week before, it takes a very fat paragraph to write in any way that's convincing to people that the three are one, that Jesus was both God and man, that the Holy Spirit is somehow in there. And of course, over the many centuries, the Holy Spirit would become known as the forgotten member of the doctrine of the Trinity, because people didn't talk a lot about it. The Holy Ghost, that seems odd, talking about how the Spirit and Jesus and God are all one and the same. It takes a lot of dense print to explain that and to keep that in people's minds. So the Polish brethren, they weren't interested in it. They, like many of the reformers of this era, they wanted to look at the Bible. They wanted to look at it rationally, but they wanted to look at the Bible, not the doctrines that came about in the conciliar age, the 4th and 5th centuries, when a lot of the doctrines of the churches were formulated hundreds of years after Jesus died. They didn't believe in holding serfs or slavery in general, of course. They didn't believe in war. They were Universalists. They didn't believe in eternal hell. But especially by Augustine, and later by John Calvin, who really picked up on Augustine's thoughts about original sin. So these Socinians, as they would become to be known, were Universalists, very early Universalists. And they also, and this is not mentioned on this slide, they believed in separation of church and state, which we'll talk about more and how that influenced many thinkers in the years to come. And most importantly, they thought Jesus was human. Now, a very, very important, maybe even a divine human, we might say enlightened human, I suppose, in modern terminology, but the Socinians believed that Jesus was human, period. And here's a coin here in the lower left. And on the back of the coin, and on the front, of course, is a depiction of Jesus. And on the back, it says, "The man Jesus, the Messiah of the kingdom of peace, came in true human nature." 1590. Just a amazingly revolutionary statement, and of course a statement from a fairly small minority of people. But Socinian thought, the Polish brethren, they were big. About 300 congregations preaching the humanity of Jesus, and they hang on a long time here, as we'll see. They spread throughout Poland, although their city, you might say, the city of their birth, where they had their printing press, was Krakow. But the Catholic Counter-Reformation is even more successful in Poland than it was in Transylvania. And that's a bit of an understatement, really. In Poland, the Jesuits also showed up. Sigismund III would be called the king of the Jesuits. They wrecked the churches of the Socinians. They had the Catholic priests there. Let me back up that slide. They had the Catholic priests there preach against the Socinians. They would loot cemeteries, wreck the cemeteries of the Socinians. Again, if you were a Socinian, you were not allowed to hold public office. As we'll find out later, Socinus was abducted, beaten up twice. Some students, it was during an Ascension Day festival, 1598, Catholic Church festival, and a likely time when dissidents, that is, the Socinians, would be likely to be beaten up or chastised in one way or the other. Well, some drunk students found Socinus out for a walk. They beat him up, threatened to throw him in the river, the Vistula. They told him, they had a sword and they threatened Socinus. They told him to recant. In other words, disavow his beliefs. Socinus wouldn't do that. He was saved by a passing professor who knew Socinus well. And the professor said, "Oh, here, I'll handle this heretic." And he took Socinus away to safety. Socinus's books would later be burned in the square of the town. Just a very rough time if you were Socinian. Socinus would, though, in the end, die of natural causes. But it was definitely, obviously, it was a close call for him several times. You remember I started session 1 of this program. We're now in session 3. But session 1 was this depiction of Iwan Tishkovitz, or as they would say in Europe, Jan, or we would say John Tishkovitz. He was a civil servant who, after his tenure was over, was tortured and killed for refusing to take an oath of office that included saying, "I believe in the Trinity." And I mentioned back then, just as an aside, he was actually beheaded before his body was burned. His tongue was cut out, left hand cut off, and then he was finally beheaded before he was burned. So he was not burned alive. A nice, what would we call that? It was not, they were being nice to Iwan for not burning him alive. And again, the bottom bullet point here, the Jesuit preachers stir up hatred for the Socinians, and many of their churches are destroyed, as well as their cemeteries. And then finally, even though, again, as I've mentioned, the Socinians hung on for many years, the Catholics say that 2 Socinian boys threw rocks at this cross, this crucifix. It was at the city limits, right outside of Rakow, and that the boys threw these stones at the crucifix. Well, the charge was sacrilege. That would be the official charge. It probably never happened. There's really no evidence. Queen Constance, at the time, a fervent Catholic, said that it did happen. And so it's King Ladislas IV who finally decides to destroy Rakow. And this is later, this is well after, as a matter of fact, this is after Queen Constance. She was one who burned Ivan Tishkovitz, made sure that he was tortured and then burned. It's King Ladislas IV, and he decides that because these 2 boys had committed sacrilege, that they should destroy Rakow. Obviously, he was looking for an excuse. The painting is entitled Arianismus Proscriptus, a prescription, a ruling against the Arians. And remember, this is at a time with anyone who demoted Jesus to any extent was called an Arian, because Arius, back in the 4th century, said that he wanted to demote Jesus a little bit. This is right before the Council of Nicaea. And so in the many following centuries, if you wanted to subordinate Jesus even a little bit. You were known as an Arian in remembrance of Arius, who got the idea started, it seems. So this is Arianismus Proscriptus. And if you look closely here, it's hard to see in this depiction, but these are the wagons. Here are the people, the Socinians, being expelled from Rakow in 1641. Then in 1658, they're finally, the hierarchy, the rulers of Poland, are finally able to get rid of all of the Socinians. John II Casimir, he was a cardinal who renounces his church position to become king of Poland. And he swears that, and this is a time where both Russia and Sweden, they're after Poland. They want Poland badly. Well, John II Casimir says that if I can defeat the Swedes, then I'll go to all the work of purging Poland of all these heretics, these Socinians especially. And he does. He defeats the Swedes. He makes good on its on his promise. The Socinians have been persecuted for well over 20 years. Then it was in 1658. They've been hanging on. Their mobs have been attacking Socinians for a long time. Their homes have been sacked. Sometimes they've been beaten to death. I should mention John Casimir is a Jesuit. Then he became a cardinal. He ignores the laws about the toleration, the law of toleration of 1573, and he tells all of the Socinians in Poland to get out. And here's the start of their act. This is the kind of thing you don't, it's a footnote in many history books. Sometimes it doesn't even appear, even though this involved thousands of people. About 1,000 of the Socinians had to stay behind and pledged to become, they said the words and said, yes, I'll be a good Catholic. They said those words. Probably 1,000 or more had to stay behind in Poland. They weren't able to travel. Here's Rakow, where we're talking about. But they go from places like Scotland to Geneva. Let me back up one slide. Here we go. Yeah. Here are their travels. They're in the Rhine-Palatinate, a very small principality, perhaps not even ruled by a king, but in what we would call, what now we call Germany up north. Prussia, Silesia, Transylvania. These are all the places where the Socinians find refuge, you might say. They also go to the Netherlands. This is significant. Socinus, when he was young, studied here in the Netherlands. And the Netherlands is already starting a very long tradition of being tolerant to people of many different religions. William of Orange of the Netherlands, it seems, would start that tradition. And as you remember, sometime later, the religious dissonance from England that we know of, the Pilgrims, they would go to the Netherlands and try and find refuge from persecution. And only later then would they take off for the shores of America. So the Socinians, and there's, I should back up and mention, remember that the Socinians had a very active printing press. They dispersed their thoughts in books widely. Well, this dispersion of the Socinians, this exodus, this enforced exodus, you might say, had the effect of, guess what, distributing the thoughts of the Socinians. I guess despots of that time and any time should be wary of this practice of kicking people out of your country if you don't like the way they think. The effect is it disperses their beliefs, and it certainly did too. As we'll see in the future here, their belief influential in the thoughts of other progressive religious thinkers in the years to come. Again, the Socinians' possessions are plundered, their houses confiscated. The best source of reading on this, although you may find it on the internet, is still from the historian of our movement, Wilbur, and we'll talk about him in just a minute. So here are their effects. John Locke will pick up on the idea of separation of church and state, which was a very Socinian idea. Joseph Priestley would quote the Socinians and would become one of the first English Unitarians, as we'll see. Same for Theophilus Lindsay. The English Unitarians were very much affected by the thoughts of the Socinians, although they would have their own separate and distinct development, as would Americans, the people of the colonies, I should say, who would also have some access to the thoughts of the Socinians. Those Unitarians there would develop in their own way, but many different people were quite aware that they were not breaking new ground necessarily. Jacobus Arminius, as I've mentioned before, the Dutch theologian that took on Calvin's idea of predestination and other things, the innate, the total worthlessness of the human soul. Jacobus Arminius was in the Netherlands and was evidently somewhat affected by the thoughts of the Socinians. It's hard to track that exactly, but there again is the liberality, the willingness to tolerate people that became characteristic of the Netherlands, and Jacobus is the one, and evidently was influenced somewhat by the thoughts of the Socinians. And then there's Thomas Jefferson, who knew about the Socinians, was another thinker who was to some extent affected by the thoughts of the Polish brethren that became known as the Socinians. Oh, and one other thought here that I wouldn't want to neglect. The Socinians are sometimes thought of as a precursor to the Enlightenment. First, there was the Renaissance, starting in 1450, but then the Enlightenment that would come before the time of the American Revolution. It was 1776. These Enlightenment thinkers here were very much affected by the Enlightenment thoughts in this time of interest in scholarship and moving away from some of the dictates of the church and outright denying the doctrines of the church. Those are some of the characteristics of the Enlightenment. And Socinianism is actually thought of as a precursor to the Enlightenment, and that it's had its own effect on what we know today as Enlightenment thinking. To close, 200 Unitarian congregations still in Transylvania. About that. They are, of course, a very Christian Unitarian. They probably find our form of Unitarianism. There is this kinship and this exchange of students and ideas and tourists who are Unitarian, who go back and forth and rub elbows, you might say. Lynn and I knew a Unitarian minister from Transylvania who came to the Star King Unitarian Universalist School in Berkeley, California. And on special days, he would wear his cape. It's very reminiscent of Dracula's cape. I believe that the cape that our friend wore in Berkeley had a higher neck collar on it, and it was very familiar in looking like something that Count Dracula would wear in the movies, of course. But this is obviously a Transylvania clergyman. And I know some of the members of our own congregation have traveled to Transylvania, a very popular thing to do. And then in Poland, and I believe I have a picture that I'll show in a slideshow here in the near future of the actual headstone of Socinus. I believe his grave is well marked. This is a very old depiction of the tomb of Faustus Socinus. And Earl Morris Wilbur, the scholar, one of the main scholars of our tradition, wrote, "We shall appreciate more deeply the value of our religious faith if we come to realize how much it has cost others to win what they have freely bequeathed to us." Of course, he's speaking not just of Socinus, but David and the many others that we'll talk about. Thank you for watching. Please let me know your thoughts on how we might do this differently if you like. I neglected to record this when I did this this past Sunday. That's why I'm making this recording with no one watching on and interacting at the time of the when we did it last Sunday. Hope you enjoyed this, and we'll do it again soon. Thanks.